Hello, and welcome to the Family Promise volunteer training. This was recorded in November of 2021. We're going to cover a lot of ground today. We'll start big, discussing some high-level topics related to the issue of homelessness. Then we'll work our way down to best practices for serving our families and details related to our shelter program. We hope to provide you with some tools and knowledge so you walk away from this training feeling more prepared to serve our families. As I mentioned, we're going to start off with some context surrounding homelessness. What are the systemic factors that contribute to a family having to join our program? And here in front of you is the main idea that we would like you to focus on when thinking about homelessness as a social issue. Homelessness is not the result of individual choices or actions. And what we hope you would learn is that homelessness is the result of a series of systemic barriers, and we'll get into some of those now. We believe that in order to build empathy and understanding for our clients, it is so important to understand the social context in which people experience homelessness. So we're going to cover racism and housing discrimination, evictions and lack of affordable housing, and poverty. It's also important to note that there are many other factors that contribute to individual experiences of homelessness. Things like domestic violence, mental health, unemployment, etc. But these are not necessarily root systemic causes. If our systems treated people equitably, and if housing were affordable and available to all, and so many people weren't living in poverty, something like domestic violence or periodic job loss wouldn't cause someone to experience homelessness. First, we cannot talk about homelessness and housing disparities without first examining one historical root of homelessness by taking a deeper dive into racial discrimination, particularly the discrimination against Black and African American folks in housing. This video gives a brief overview of the process of redlining and how we still see its harmful impacts today. While you watch, pay attention to the consequences of housing segregation and discrimination, and make note of how you think those consequences contribute to homelessness or housing instability. So hopefully you can see how redlining directly impacted and continues to impact housing opportunities for Black folks. But what else did redlining impact? Some examples include justice involvement, health outcomes, habitability of apartments. These things are also interwoven with economic opportunity and advancement. And how do those things contribute to homelessness? Some examples include they talked about health outcomes being worse in areas that were historically redlined. I can't tell you the number of families that say they had an unexpected medical bill or medical issue which led them to no longer being able to cover their basic needs like rent. Another example is policing. Historically redlined areas have a much higher police presence, which leads to a greater likelihood of being arrested. Housing programs are extremely strict about criminal backgrounds, sometimes even about minor charges. Having a criminal record can make it very hard to find housing and also work. So over-policing also contributes to homelessness. A major takeaway from this video should be that where one lives and what housing options one has affects everything. And this is the type of contextual thinking that we want to bring when discussing issues of homelessness. By and large, homelessness is not the fault of any one individual. It is the result of our systems being designed to uplift certain groups and degrade others. Other times, it's the result of unintended consequences and system failures. With all of that in mind, we can see the legacy of redlining still today when we look at how certain groups are overrepresented in the population of folks who are unhoused. This is 2019 data from the National Alliance to End Homelessness. You can see that when looking at race of the population experiencing homelessness, so these top two bar graphs, Black individuals, this navy blue bar, make up about 13% of the US population, and 40% of the population of folks experiencing homelessness. So they're majorly overrepresented. Native American, Alaskan Native, and Native Hawaiians are also overrepresented in the population of folks experiencing homelessness as opposed to the general population. Asians and white folks are actually unrepresented in the unhoused population as compared with the general population. So, if housing and economic opportunities were fair and free of racial discrimination, then no groups would be over or underrepresented. And locally, people experiencing homelessness in Denver are also disproportionately Black, Indigenous people of color. While more than half, so 55% of Denver residents are white, only 43% of those experiencing homelessness in the 2020 point in time count are white. So these national trends occur locally as well. Next, we're going to talk about evictions. This is another very important piece in understanding the context in which families experience homelessness. Evictions are definitely top of mind for a lot of folks right now with the recent expiration of the eviction moratorium. This next video dives into the issues of eviction and our country's affordable housing crisis.
You just finished watching our CBSN original Priced Out, LA's Hidden Homeless, about the dire lack of affordable housing in the city. But the issue is not unique to Los Angeles. The United States is one of the world's wealthiest countries with one of the worst inequality problems. We wanted to find out why. For that, I sat down with Matthew Desmond. He is a sociology professor at Princeton and author of the book Evicted: Poverty and Profit in the American City. He chronicles what he calls, quote, a vicious cycle that deepens our country's vast inequality. When we think about homelessness, we often don't consider the role that eviction plays and how once you are evicted, it can lead to a cycle of homelessness. Can you explain how that works?
Sure. I mean, eviction causes loss. You lose your home, but often lose your stuff. Your kids lose your school. You lose your community and neighbors. It takes a good amount of time and money to build up a home, and eviction can just erase all that. An eviction comes with this mark, goes to the court system, and many landlords say no. So that means people, after they're evicted, are pushed into homelessness, and then they're pushed into worse housing and worse neighborhoods after their eviction happens.
It stays on their record then.
It follows you around, that's right.
Mm-hmm. It seems as if, and maybe this is my, perception, and maybe this isn't the truth, but it seems as if we're hearing more and more stories of eviction. Is it easier to get evicted these days than it was in the past?
There used to be a time where eviction was rare and scandalous. It drew crowds. People protested eviction. And we've gone from that place in America to a place where if you're a low-income person, you've grown really used to, the rumble of the trucks in the morning and effects lining the curb. Eviction is completely overturning low-income families and schools and communities.
And what historical events or economic events played a role in this? Did the recession of 2007, 2008 make things worse?
The recession absolutely played a role, but for many people facing eviction, they've faced a recession before the housing crisis, after the housing crisis. For some, it's been a lifetime of recession-like conditions. What we're in is the middle of an enormous housing crisis, one of the worst our country has ever seen. Rents and utility costs have gone up, incomes for Americans have been flat, and the federal government hasn't bridged the gap. And so we've reached a point where the majority of poor renting families are now spending most of their income on housing costs.
And yet all the economic indicators right now tell us that the economy is booming, that
right.
There's low unemployment,
right.
The economy is growing, jobs for everyone. Right. So what's going on? Where's the disconnect?
Right, there's the economy, then there's the economy. There's the economy in terms of the S&P and stock market and Wall Street, and then there's the economy for regular Americans and wages. And if you're living in a home headed by someone with a high school education or less, your income has been very flat over the last 20 years. In some areas of the country, it's fallen in real terms. And as that has happened, rents and utilities have gone up. Here's one statistic. Between 1995 and today, median rent, adjusting for inflation, has increased over 70% in America. So imagine, there's this closing gap between what many families are bringing in and what they have to pay for just basic shelter today.
And you focused on Milwaukee in your
Yeah.
book. Does eviction, the process of eviction, vary from city to city?
It does. So I wrote a book about Milwaukee, but then I've formed a research team at Princeton called the Eviction Lab, and we've tried to build the nation's first ever national database of eviction. The federal government doesn't collect this data, so we thought, let's try. And so we've published that data, and we can map and we can answer that question for the very first time. And what we're learning is that Milwaukee's not even in the top 50 highest evicting cities. Who's up there? Richmond, Virginia's there, 1 in 9 renter homes evicted every year. Tulsa, Oklahoma. Albuquerque, New Mexico, 1 in 21 renter homes evicted every year. Who's talking about Tulsa and Albuquerque when it comes to the housing crisis? We absolutely should be.
And what's to account for the variation? Do some cities simply have tougher laws on the books, making it harder for landlords to evict tenants?
We're still trying to get to that question, but it does seem the law matters. Little things, how much it costs to evict someone, how long you have to wait to file an eviction, that seems to matter very much. But one thing that's striking to me is that in some hot, very expensive markets that we talk about a lot in the media, sure, there is a housing crisis in LA and San Francisco and New York City, but there's also a housing crisis in rural America, in low-cost cities in the South and in the Midwest. This is a nationwide problem.
Talk about some of the misperceptions about people who become homeless, who are evicted. I mean, often there is this idea that, well, these people didn't work hard enough, they didn't manage their money properly, they weren't responsible, so it's their fault that they no longer have a home.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a misperception?
I think that when I hear something like that, I think of the people that I've met in my reporting and research, and I'm thinking of a woman I've met named Vanessa Sullivan. She was a home health aide trying to raise 3 kids as a single mom. She was living in Trenton, New Jersey, and she was part of the working homeless, this new phrase that we have now about people that are working full-time or close to full-time and still can't afford a roof over their head. So we might say from a position of security or privilege, I've worked really hard to get where I am. But Vanessa's worked really hard to get where she is too. So I don't think that's the full story.
So let me expand the conversation past housing just for a moment, since you study inequality, and that's a big issue going into the 2020 election, and a lot of Democrats have ideas about this, including higher taxes on the wealthy to fund some of these programs that you're talking about. Is that something that you think would make sense?
So in the housing world, we have a social policy that's pretty upside down. And so the money that we spend on homeowner tax subsidies, especially the mortgage interest deduction, that far, far outpaces direct housing assistance to the needy.
A phenomenon here in New York that I'm sure takes place in cities all around the country is that a lower income neighborhood suddenly becomes trendy, wealthier people move in, the people who lived there originally can no longer afford the rent. So is gentrification part of the problem?
It is part of the problem. It's not where most evictions happen, though. Most evictions nationwide are happening in non-gentrifying, poor, segregated neighborhoods. Well, even there, people can't afford the roof over their head. So why, right? Why is that? And so when I lived in Milwaukee, for example, I was living in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. I was only paying $50 less than people living in the middle-class neighborhoods of the city. And so you get a lot less house, you get a lot more crime and poverty in your neighborhood, but you don't pay that much less.
How does that work? The market factors there are confusing to me because there's got to be some supply and demand when it comes to housing, correct?
So there are some cities like New York and Seattle where there's a supply crunch, but there are a lot of cities where they do have a lot of supply. But people living in the poor neighborhoods are kind of stuck there. They're excluded from homeownership on account of their credit or their income or their poverty. They're often excluded from living outside of segregated neighborhoods because of racial discrimination. And so they are cordoned off into a certain sector of the city, and that produces kind of the opportunity to exploit.
Is that the short-sightedness that we're talking about? It takes a little bit extra effort to see past your own situation?
I think that's part of it. And the way we talk about poverty in America, we don't take personal responsibility for it. The non-poor people. If we're a little bit conservative, we talk about people's work ethic or family values maybe. And if we're liberal, we talk about the safety net or education. And those two ways of talking about inequality let us all off the hook. It's as if there's this enormous problem in the United States. 1 in 5 kids don't have enough money coming in to afford basic necessities in their house.
So 1 in 5 children in America live in poverty.
Right. Yes. And
that's incredible for the wealthiest country in the world.
That's shameful for the wealthiest country in the world.
So, as we saw in the video, we are experiencing a major affordable housing crisis. And that's true for Colorado. as well. We are ranked as ninth least affordable in the United States. This report shown goes state by state and comes up with what they call a housing wage, which essentially means the hourly amount that a person needs to earn in order to avoid spending too much on rent. In Colorado, that hourly wage is $26.45. That's how much someone needs to earn to comfortably afford a two-bedroom apartment. This means that Coloradans need to work more than 2 full-time jobs at minimum wage to afford a two-bedroom apartment. And this housing wage is even higher in the Denver metro region. Locally, the affordable housing crisis can at least partially be attributed to the rapid population growth experienced in Denver. From 2010 to 2019, there was a 22% increase in the number of households living in Denver, which far surpasses the national growth rate of 7%. The majority of these new households have higher incomes and are able to afford higher rents and more expensive homes. Families with low income, many of whom are native to Denver, are being priced out of their own city. And finally, we come to one final root cause of homelessness, which is poverty. It's not rocket science. People with financial safety nets and generational wealth, people with higher incomes, do not experience homelessness at the same rates as individuals and families who earn less money and who have historically earned less money. Study after study has shown that the poorer someone is growing up, the more likely they are to stay poor through adulthood. True social mobility on a large scale is relatively non-existent in the US. In fact, 40 million people, which could make up the entire state of California, live below the poverty line here in the US. This video showcases one woman's experience living in poverty. Keep in mind that while she's not currently experiencing homelessness, hers is a situation that many of our families have experience in and where many of our families are coming from when they enter into our shelter program.
My name is Sophia Cotton. I'm 22. I have a 1-year-old son. I'm a single mom. I make $7.50 an hour at McDonald's. Nothing. I make $230 to $240 every 2 weeks. I've been working there for almost a year. I haven't had a raise since I started working there. They have a slow week, you go home every day. I came into work one morning, I had to be there at 7. And once the general manager came in, she came in like 7:30, 8 o'clock, and she was like, oh, okay, well, Sophia, you can clock out. And I'm like, well, I just got here. She's like, oh, well, we don't need you, labor's high. You can go ahead and clock out. It's not really matter to them if we're making our hours and getting paid. I got $261 in food stamps last month. Then they deducted it to $216. To go through the whole month for $216 is feeding my son, me, every day. Like feeding breakfast, lunch, dinner. So I buy like frozen foods that I can keep in the refrigerator, on the freezer. I don't buy fresh fruits and stuff like that because it's not guaranteed that it'll be eaten all. Make it stretch. Come on. With child care, I get CCIS, which is like covers your child care or any daycare that you would like your child to go to. I do pay a copayment for $10 a week. His dad's actually incarcerated, so it's like just me. Come on. So I want my son to not have to struggle the way I struggle. He's going to have a good paying job. He's not going to have to pick through anything. He's like, I'm going to do anything he want to do, he'll be able to do. Give me a cup. I'm going to make it easier for him so he won't have to see a struggle at all. Because I'll rather struggle for him than him struggle for me. Like, I just want him to know. Really I'll make it easier for him. My number one always is to make sure that my rent is paid. So I make sure that we have somewhere to live. Me and my sister split it. We paid $220 a piece. Housing Authority pays $125 of it for us. One of my checks was $238, and it was like the week that rent was due. So it was like I paid the rent. I had no other choice. But then I found myself borrowing and borrowing. So when my next check come, that's my check that I use like to get diapers, my son some clothes. Like that's the check that I use to get those things. So it's like I find myself breaking into that because I have to pay everybody back. I only go to the doctor like if I need to go or I have no other choice to go, I'll go. I needed a root canal for one of my back teeth, and it was like, well, you know, if you get a root canal, I think they told me it was like around $300 something, but they needed like a down payment. Like I couldn't, either I had to pay the whole thing or put down like half down payment. So I'm just like, okay, well, how much would it be like to pull a tooth or whatever? And they like, oh, well, it's free to pull a tooth, but we'd rather not pull a tooth because it's savable. And then I'm like, well, I'd rather you pull it because it's like I can't pay for it, but it's bothering me and I don't want the pain. So I'd rather you just pull a tooth. It's not really what you want to do, but it's what you have to settle for because you can't afford to get the right dental care. If I wasn't getting like rent, assistance, food stamps, or childcare help, I think I would still be like living in a shelter or something because I wouldn't be able to pay rent and take care of my son and, you know, make sure he clothed and fed off of the checks that I've received from McDonald's. Come on, eat. It bothers me that I have to rely on government help, and I know that they making billions and billions of dollars. Like, it's like, why should I have to rely on them when I'm working for you? I should be able to rely on you to pay me for doing the things that you want me to do for you. And I believe that sooner or later it'll change, and I won't be struggling, and I won't have to, you know, pick from eating and buying my son something. Like, I'll be able to do both.
So again, we come back to this idea. Homelessness is not the result of individual choices or actions. Why is this so important? Because our core beliefs about the families we work with and the factors that contributed to their needing shelter inform how we treat them. Whether we realize it or not, our conscious and unconscious bias and judgments color our worldview and the way we interact with those around us. We're going to move into some general best practices next, but first we wanted to share some current statistics regarding the outcomes our families have made this year, despite it being a very challenging year. As of November 2021, we've served 100 families so far in the shelter program. 91 of those families have exited the program, 84% moved to stable housing, 81% became more financially stable, and 64% exited employed, in an educational program or receiving disability. This employment, etc. statistic is a little bit lower than what we're used to, but we can definitely attribute that to the pandemic, and we expect to see that rise again next year. So when looking at shelter best practices, we're going to cover emotional safety, cultural respect, boundaries and confidentiality, physical safety, and share some resources. The first step toward creating a good shelter experience, or really to working with families experiencing homelessness in any context, is to foster emotional safety. And one way to do that is to recognize and understand trauma. So what is trauma? Trauma is, simply put, an emotional response to a terrible event or series of events that creates feelings of helplessness and disrupts a person's sense of control. Examples of traumatic events include, but are not limited to, childhood abuse, all types of assault, domestic violence, incarceration, natural disasters, loss of a loved one, etc. It's important to remember that something that might cause trauma to one person may not be traumatic to another person. Similarly, everyone's traumatic responses differ, and one person may act one way in response to a traumatic event, while another person who experienced the same event may react in a totally different way. Homelessness is trauma. It's many times caused by a traumatic event or series of events, and it's also in itself a traumatic experience for many. Homelessness is accompanied by so much loss, not only loss of one's home, but also their belongings, their neighborhood and surroundings, their social supports, their schedule, routine, and their control. It's also important to note that once a traumatic experience has ended, it is not actually over for the person who experienced it. The trauma manifests itself in a person's body, mind, emotions, and behaviors. And what that means for our shelter guests is that sometimes we may witness behaviors from them that we might classify as difficult or bad, negative. However, these might be reactions to trauma. Some examples include seeing someone have a lack of motivation or energy. This could be a sign that they're experiencing depression as a result of trauma. They might be complaining about the accommodations, food, guidelines. This could be a trauma response related to feeling a lack of control over their environment. Maybe it's not that they don't like the food, but what they don't like is that they don't get to choose their food, which is such a normal part of most people's lives in the US. Complaining about other guests or volunteers or having conflict. This could be someone perceiving others as abusive due to past abuse. They might also have diminished emotional regulation, which could lead to outbursts. You might also see guests isolating themselves. Maybe they aren't coming out of their rooms, but they could be feeling unsafe or feeling detached or depressed. Finally, you might witness someone experiencing a lot of pain, complaining about pain, getting sick or worn down a lot. And actually, an impaired immune system may also be due to trauma. We use this photo of an iceberg because it is a perfect illustration of what we're talking about. When interacting with people, we only see the surface, but what's underneath is everything they've experienced that informs how they interact with the world. So knowing what we now know about trauma, what do we do with that information? The way that we create emotional safety for our guests who have experienced trauma is by practicing trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care emphasizes safety for survivors and gives people opportunities to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment. Some ways to provide trauma-informed care in our shelter program include helping guests feel safe in your space. This looks like allowing folks to spend time in their rooms if they don't feel like coming out. The ability to lock room doors, restroom doors, shower doors. And remember also that safety doesn't just have to mean physical safety, but also emotional safety. And you can do this by validating people's emotions when they're expressing things to you. And you can also do this by using calm and easygoing tones when speaking with our guests. Uphold dignity and respect. On top of all of the loss associated with homelessness, people experiencing homelessness are also stigmatized and may experience a loss of dignity. So it's crucial to treat families experiencing homelessness with respect. This includes avoiding overly personal questions, using preferred names and pronouns, respecting cultural practices, and hearing people out when they have a complaint or request. This also means avoiding talking about guests while they're within earshot, or making them feel separate from the volunteers. Using person-first language. Person-first language is a term that means putting the person before the descriptor, meaning we want to say families experiencing homelessness or families experiencing a housing crisis, rather than homeless families or homeless people. This can also be used in other contexts like person with a disability, person managing an addiction, etc. By putting the person first, you're acknowledging that that person is so much more than their housing status or their disability or diagnosis. One caveat to this is that if someone refers to themselves a certain way, we want to echo that language. So if someone says, I'm a disabled person, then we want to use that same verbiage. It can be a little confusing and it's okay to mess up too. Just try again the next time. Asking for input. If there are things that you have the capacity to be flexible on, ask for input regarding what guests might prefer. This gives some power and control to people who have lost it. One way that we try to do this is by providing grocery suggestions to you all that come straight from the guests. Providing choices. The main way this plays out at our congregations is through food. You can consider providing multiple side dishes and or making the lunch items available at dinner time as well to increase options. We're not asking you to provide a buffet, but just a few different choices. Additionally, avoid becoming upset with the guest if they choose not to eat or if they eat their own food. What our guests eat for meals is truly one of the last remaining aspects that they have control over in their lives. Remain consistent but flexible. While it's beneficial to uphold boundaries and guidelines that support safety and the overall function of the program, you can communicate boundaries and guidelines that still allow for flexibility. For example, our guideline that allows guests to leave the congregation after dinner and run errands so long as they're back in by 9 p.m. This ensures that folks are back within a reasonable hour so everyone can get to bed, but allows folks more freedom so they don't feel trapped in one place. Also, in order to remain consistent and clear in your communication, be sure to go through your guidelines with guests on their first night, provide them with a copy of your guidelines, and post the guidelines where folks can see them. That way there's no confusion. Modeling pro-social behaviors. This is pretty straightforward, but sometimes the best you can do is model what you would like to see from others. The fishbowl effect. This might occur on those nights when you have a large group of volunteers, perhaps a youth group, who's there for dinner, and there are just way more volunteers present than is necessary to provide the service. By having more volunteers than guests, or a disproportionate number, guests may feel as though they are in a fishbowl, or like they're on display or meant to be part of some quote-unquote experience for the volunteers. But our guests are with you in order to be kept safe. They're not there to provide anyone with an experience, whether it's educational, spiritual, that's just not the point. So we definitely want to limit the number of volunteers present to the number that's absolutely necessary to get the job done. Finally, we want to respect guests' cultures and identities. One example of this is that we often work with families from other religious or spiritual backgrounds, so we ask that when prayer is involved, you simply invite guests to pray with you, but make it clear that it's optional. And in the next couple of slides, we'll touch on some other aspects of respect related to culture and identity. We'll talk next about microaggressions. Microaggressions are brief and very common remarks related to a person's identity. They communicate hostile, negative, or derogatory ideas about race, class, weight, age, disability, religion, etc. And they may be intentional or unintentional, and this part is very important. There's a phrase we use called impact over intent, which means that it doesn't matter if I didn't intend for my words to harm someone or if I didn't intend to offend. What matters is that a person was offended, and it's my responsibility to learn from that and apologize and not repeat the phrase or do the thing again. So these are some common microaggressions. You are so blank for a blank person. This one trips a lot of people up because it sounds like a compliment, but it's really not. Some examples might be, you're so well dressed for a homeless person. You're so well spoken for an immigrant. Or you're so pretty for a big girl. And what this says to someone is that it's unusual or noteworthy for someone who looks like them or is in their circumstance to be intelligent, well-spoken, well-dressed, etc. It implies that other people from similar backgrounds are not those things, and that's offensive. Another big one is, I don't see color or I don't see race. We understand that a lot of folks were raised in the era of colorblindness, this time of kumbaya, where we preach that everyone is equal regardless of color, gender, religion, etc. But we're past that and are at this point of reckoning where we realize that all races and ethnicities are not treated equally in this country. On top of that, saying I don't see race erases the culture of the person on the other end and all of the experiences that accompany that, including all the wonderful cultural things that they love and celebrate about themselves. Finally, we come to the myth of meritocracy. Anyone can succeed if they work hard enough. This is the idea that in America, the land of opportunity, anyone can be successful if they just pull themselves up by their bootstraps. This myth implies that getting ahead in society is based on individual merit, like hard work, good attitude, good morals. This is harmful because we know that many people do work hard and do everything they're supposed to do, but still can't seem to get ahead. This myth downplays all of the systemic issues that we've talked about so far. Are there people who rise up out of incredibly difficult situations on their own? Absolutely, but they are the exception and not the rule. We want also to touch on respect around gender and sexuality. At Family Promise, we pride ourselves on being one of few family shelters that accepts all family makeups, including LGBTQ couples, trans folks, etc. People from the LGBTQ plus community, particularly youths, experience homelessness at a higher rate, and folks who are trans and gender nonconforming are more likely to be unsheltered. A, because shelters might not accept them in the first place, and B, because treatment within those shelters from staff, volunteers, other guests can be really crummy or even dangerous. So, how can we be better than some of our counterparts? Normalize introducing yourself and wearing name tags that include your pronouns. Do not assume anyone's gender or sexuality. We as a staff are committed to doing a better job at communicating guests' pronouns and gender identities and sharing info related to those types of things if it impacts their family makeup or if they would like us to do so. So please pay attention to what's communicated around that. Be open to messing up, then improving. We all mess up. Our brains are wired into a binary pattern from a very young age. So you might mess up someone's pronouns or gender, but it's better to be open to trying than humbly correct yourself when you mess up or when someone corrects you, than to avoid the person or just consistently saying the wrong thing. Next up, in fostering emotional safety, we want to uphold boundaries and confidentiality. So some pointers. Do not initiate physical contact with adults or children. Do not drive guests in your personal vehicle unless it's authorized by staff or in an extreme emergency. Allow guests to share personal information on their own terms, and the same goes for you. You don't have to answer overly personal questions either. Avoid being the only person in a room with a guest. Do not give gifts or purchase items for guests above and beyond the necessities unless it's authorized by staff. Listen and validate people's emotions, but please do not give therapeutic advice. And keep in mind that guest info is confidential. Don't share any guest info, including names, with anyone outside of the family promise circle. And dress appropriately for your hosting role. Next, some conversation do's and don'ts. This was a highly requested topic from our survey when we asked for suggestions for this training. So some do's. Do make small talk. Introduce yourself and share basic info about you and your family. Check in about how things are going for them at the congregation. Ask how their kids are doing and if they need help with anything. You can ask if they're from Colorado if they moved from out of town. This is a pretty common thing to ask here in Colorado, where we have a lot of transplants. You can ask how their day was. You can also check in about things that they may have shared with you before. If they shared that they had a job interview, you can check in about that and ask how it went. Give families space and time to settle in before making conversation. A lot of people, despite what kind of situation they're in, need time to decompress when they're first getting home in the evening. Don't ask why a family is in shelter. Don't comment on someone's appearance or ask about someone's religion or politics. Don't dive deep into personal stuff, and don't provide therapeutic advice. Also, don't let your kids ask personal questions. Sometimes kids just don't know and they say something that is offensive, but please correct them later and make sure that they don't do it again. And don't take it personally if someone keeps to themselves. Next up, we're going to talk through physical safety. It's so much easier to uphold emotional safety when you feel physically safe. So we'll get into that next. We're going to cover some de-escalation techniques, what to do in emergencies, and we'll touch on child abuse and neglect. So some de-escalation tips. One of the most intimidating things about working with people of any kind is feeling like you aren't sure what to do if someone becomes escalated or upset. So here are some general tips for those situations. First, you want to stay calm through your composure and your body language, and you just want to listen. A lot of times people just need to vent and need to be listened to. And while listening, you might hear information that could be helpful in trying to solve the situation. Remind them that you're there to help, but also remain firm and realistic with what you can offer. You might be viewed as part of the problem or telling someone something that they don't want to hear, so it's important to remind them that you are there to help them. And then empathize. This can really help the client feel heard, and it promotes safety in the relationship. Establish and maintain boundaries. If a client is yelling, swearing, or threatening your safety, let them know that you want to hear what they have to say, but they have to communicate respectfully. And then finally, if someone is so escalated that you're concerned for your safety, share those concerns with anyone else who's there. Call the on-call staff person at Family Promise. Take note of where your exits are in case you need to leave. And if a client behavior doesn't change and it's threatening the safety of the group, you can ask them to leave, or you can call us and we'll ask them to leave. Next is a video that I think does a good job at putting those de-escalation tips into practice so you can hear what a conversation might sound like.
My pleasure. They are referring to a technique I learned in my educator training, primarily for dealing with angry parents. If you're looking for a way to be aggressive back to people, this is not your thing. This is very passive. It's very peaceful. It's very waterbender. People liked the Avatar: The Last Airbender references I did in those other videos, so I'm going to keep using those. Step 1, how to redirect lightning. Most of the time when us educators deal with an angry person, that person has had time to be angry. They've had time to think and overthink and justify their rage. So it's just been building up inside of them, and it must be released. So your first priority when they're throwing all of that electricity and lightning at you is you have to let them get it all out. Earnest attention, things like please go on and nodding are your friends. It is imperative that you do not let the lightning pass through your heart. The stuff being said is probably going to be really mean and really aggressive, but you can't react. You have to maintain your composure, let them get it all out, and prepare for your response. Always avoid reacting. Strive to respond, because that's what the angry person is doing. They're reacting to something that makes them angry. Now for the redirection. Once you've received that entire bolt of negative energy they've sent at you, you are literally going to send it right back. After they've exhausted themselves getting all of their thoughts and feelings out, you are just going to repeat it back to them very thoughtfully, peacefully, calmly. And then you finish with the phrase, "That's what you said. Is that what you meant?" Most people, after expelling all of their aggressive emotional energy, once they have their mean, aggressive rudeness stated back to them in a calm, peaceful tone, they have second thoughts about it. Essentially, what you're doing is giving them an out. You have to be gracious, you have to be kind and understanding. Don't make them feel bad like they're submitting to you or the entire process is compromised. No matter how that last part goes or how long it takes, you always end with the same phrase. "I want to work through this with you, and I believe we can." That last part is important because it's hopeful, because you're about to lay down some cold, hard, honest facts. You are now going to tell them the facts of the situation and what you can do and what you cannot do. There's no different angle, there's no clever solution or trickety trick that's going to move that rock. You've got to face it head on. One of these conversations might look like this. "You mean to tell me that my son can't play football because he's failing a stupid theater class? What do you even know? You're barely older than a kid yourself. This is a waste of everyone's time." Okay, so what I'm hearing is that my vocation, theater, is not as important as football. It is a waste of everyone's time, and I am not qualified or old enough to teach. That's what you said. Is that what you meant? "No, that's not how I really feel. Sorry, I'm just really stressed and upset about this. I want to work through this with you, and I believe we can. I can't go back and change any grades, but some of those missed assignments, I will allow him to make them up." The key is to not give in to emotional reaction. To bend another's energy, your own spirit must be unbendable.
All right, next up, responding to emergencies. First, we have listed just some general steps to take in a medical emergency, so please be sure to review those. But if you've never received a Red Cross training and that's something you're interested in, there's a great online first aid training through the Red Cross website. It's about, I think, $35, but it goes pretty in depth and is extremely helpful as a good first introductory training into some very common medical emergencies. So I would recommend checking that out if you're interested. Some common questions that we get in terms of emergencies: what if a guest doesn't want us to call an ambulance? If a guest is responsive and refuses an ambulance, that's their right, but then you can discuss with them how else they might get to the hospital. Are they able to drive themselves? Do they want to call an Uber or a Lyft? Is there someone you can call who will come pick them up? If you think a guest needs medical attention and you're willing to pay for an Uber or Lyft for them, that's greatly appreciated, but it's not an expectation on our end. It's also not expected that you transport someone to the hospital in your own vehicle, nor should that be your first solution. But if in a true emergency that's the decision you make, we will not fault you for it. If you need help talking these things through with a guest in the moment or with a staff person, please give the on-call staff a ring and we will speak with you or speak with the guest to help problem solve. What do we do with the kids if a parent goes to the hospital? Whenever possible, kids should go to the hospital with their parent or stay behind with the other parent if there's a two-parent family. In some cases, guests might establish strong, trusting relationships with one another and will ask to leave their kids with another guest, not in the family. That's okay if it's necessary, but kids should never be left with just a volunteer. Please call the on-call staff in these situations and we'll help you talk it through. When to call the on-call staff? When you don't know how to proceed and you can't reach a conclusion or a solution with a client, when you need a second opinion, or when you need to report something in a timely manner. We don't need to be alerted every time someone goes to urgent care or to the hospital, unless it's a situation like what we've described above. But if it's not something that you feel we need to know about in the moment, you can just send us an email. We also don't need to be alerted in the moment when someone is late for dinner. We would first ask you to reach out to them first with the contact info in the host binder. But if it gets to be pretty late, like 9, 10 p.m., and you still haven't been able to reach them and they haven't shown up, then we'll gladly help you work through a solution. In a true emergency, when safety is at risk, please call 911 and ensure that guests and volunteers on site are safe before calling the on-call staff, but then definitely give us a call. Also, please remember to review the safety plans that are in the host binder. We don't have time to go deep into child abuse and neglect, but wanted to highlight a few things. Please remember that parenting styles vary from person to person and culture to culture. But if you suspect abuse or neglect at Family Promise, please contact us. We are mandatory reporters and we will make that report. We might ask you for all of the details, or if you're interested or open to it, maybe you would make the report alongside us. But we will definitely be making that report and figuring out the best way to do so to keep that child safe. We did list the reporting number here, 1-844-CO4-KIDS, and there's a free mandatory reporter training linked below. Here are a list of helpful resources, both for you and for families staying at your congregation. You might wish to post some of these numbers in a common area where guests can see them. Some things to note: when you're calling 911, if it's a mental health crisis or a nonviolent emergency, ask for a crisis response team or a support team that includes a co-responder. Many communities, including Denver and Aurora, now have these crisis response teams, and if they're available, they will send a crisis response team that includes a paramedic and a mental health professional rather than a police officer. And when you're calling 911, please communicate as much detail as possible to mitigate the risk of a negative police interaction. For medical questions, it's helpful to determine if there's a volunteer on your team or within your congregation with medical training who's willing to be on call for you to call them up with any medical questions throughout your host week. We've also have a list of Medicaid-approved urgent care facilities in the host manual. And then we've listed some other important hotlines below as well. So what are we at Family Promise doing to address all of the things that we've discussed so far? One way is through providing shelter, which is what brings most of you here today. So in terms of our 2022 shelter plans, we are sheltering families in two ways in 2022. We will have our rotational model, which if you've volunteered with us at our shelter before or at your congregation, this is what we're referring to. We'll have 15 congregations in 2022 who are hosting 2 to 4 weeks per year for 1 to 2 weeks at a time. And as usual, we'll have 4 families at each congregation, and they'll be moving every 1 to 2 weeks on Sundays. Families are at the congregation from approximately 6 p.m. till 7 a.m., no change there. Again, guests eat dinner and sleep at the congregation like most people are used to. And then you will still be providing that van transportation with our van, and that occurs twice daily at 7 a.m. and 5 p.m. One change to note about the 2022 rotation is that if your congregation opted into it, you might be hosting families 2 weeks in a row. If so, you will still take families to the day site on that first Sunday in between your first and second hosting weeks. Families still have to attend a life skills class, do chores, and we'll be doing our COVID testing on Sundays as well. Some people have asked what to do with families' belongings on that middle Sunday in between the host weeks. If you need to use those rooms where families are staying for other Sunday happenings, it's okay to ask families to pack up Saturday night or Sunday morning and move their things to a different space, then unpack again that evening when they come back. It's still more convenient for them than having to move entirely. And then we will also be operating a static site. We will have 4 families who will have evening and nightly access to a shelter space at Holy Shepherd, which is located at 9th and Kipling. So we will have congregations adopting host weeks there as well. And then we will also have contract staff kind of filling in the gaps when we don't have congregational support, and they'll provide the groceries, meals, and evening and nighttime coverage. These are our primary volunteer roles at the rotation, in the shelter rotation. These will be very familiar to folks who have volunteered with us in the past. We have our van driver, who picks families up at the congregation in the morning at 7 a.m. and who picks families up at the day site at 5 p.m. in the evening and takes folks back to the congregation. So the van simply goes between the congregation and the day site, nowhere else, and it's a 15-passenger van provided by Family Promise. The van driver may also be called off if there are no families riding the van. We also have our dinner volunteers who prepare and serve a hot meal for up to 4 families. They also assist with cleanup after dinner, and these folks remain flexible with numbers, allergies, and other restrictions, which will be shared ahead of time but are also always subject to change. And we oftentimes have leftovers, and those leftovers can be sent to the day site because we have other families from other programs who hang out at the day site and can definitely benefit from a hot meal. We also have our evening hosts. These folks attend to family needs after dinner. This includes helping folks pack their lunches, overseeing laundry and showers, etc. And then we have our overnight hosts. 2 overnight hosts are preferred, although 1 is okay in a pinch. I know it's a hard role to fill. And these hosts sleep over at the congregation and attend to any needs that may arise throughout the night. And these folks may need to let latecomers in after work. So some families work pretty late, and when they arrive at the congregation, they'll knock or ring the bell or call the host's cell phone. And so it's up to the overnight host to let them in. There are other roles that are not shown, but those roles, as well as these, are covered far more in depth in the host manual. So please refer to that document for more information. And these are our primary roles at the static site. And you'll notice they look pretty similar to the rotational model. Groceries are just dropped off. You'll receive a grocery list from a staff member the Wednesday before, and then you simply purchase and drop off the groceries to the static site on the Sunday at the beginning of the host week. Dinner is also drop-off only. Dinner volunteers, again, will receive a head count and allergy info ahead of time. Then you'll just prepare and drop the meal off at Holy Shepherd around 6 p.m. And it's okay if the meal needs to be reheated. Families can eat anytime, so a lot of them will be reheating it anyhow. And this only occurs on Sundays, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. On the off days, families cook their own meals or eat leftovers. And then we have our evening and overnight hosts. Same setup and duties pretty much as in the rotational model, although the evening host is there during dinner. So the evening coverage is from 5 to 8 p.m. and then the overnight hosts are from 8 p.m. till 8 a.m. So coordinators or congregation leaders indicated whether they would be supporting the static site earlier this year. So that info is reflected on the host calendar in the static site columns. And it also shows which roles your congregation signed up to cover. If you haven't signed up, keep in mind you can support the static site without taking on all of these roles. So for example, you might adopt a host week but just cover grocery and dinner drop-offs, and that's great. That's still really helpful. You can also sign up at any time throughout the year. We still have a lot of openings if you're not quite sure yet whether you can commit. And again, please see the host manuals, the static site host manual for more information. Finally, everyone's favorite topic, what are we doing to keep folks as safe as possible during the COVID-19 pandemic? Whether these precautions are in place will depend on local public health recommendations. If we were to start today, these would be in place, so we do anticipate these still being in effect early next year when we get started. We'll have COVID testing for guests and Family Promise staff once per week with additional testing as needed at the day site, and these will be administered by trained Family Promise staff. Masks are required for everyone, regardless of your vaccination status, except while people are eating or in their bedrooms. Please provide a mask if a family does not have one. We will also provide masks at the day site. No large volunteer groups. Limit the number of volunteers present to the number necessary to get the job done. Vaccinations are required for all in-person volunteers. We will not be asking for proof of vaccination. We are using an honor system, with the exception of Denver congregation, where there is a mandate that requires proof. Vaccines are not mandatory for our guests in shelter. We actually cannot mandate these vaccines because we receive federal funding. We also cannot tell you which families are vaccinated versus which families are not, because this is private and protected health information, which is why we're requiring masks and all of these other things for everyone, regardless of vaccination status. We ask that you conduct daily symptom screenings each evening as guests arrive. We'll provide you with a no-touch thermometer in the host binder, which will come to you on the first Sunday of your host week on the van. And as families arrive in the evening, you'll ask them questions included on the COVID symptom screener in the host manual, marking down their responses. You'll then keep those completed health screening forms in the host binder, and we'll also email you a blank copy of the form prior to your host week and print out blank copies in the host binder as well. Guests with symptoms or a positive test will be quarantined off-site, and we'll touch more on that here in a minute. Families should also be asked to wash their hands or use hand sanitizer upon arrival. And we want to make sure we're upholding social distancing of at least 6 feet at all times. On occasion, sometimes families will give each other rides, want to sit together at dinner, etc. While we can't control how families socialize outside of the shelter, we do want to encourage families to maintain a safe distance and keep their masks on while in our space to mitigate risk as much as possible. So please try to remind families to do that. In terms of social distancing in common areas, if there's enough space to keep families socially distanced in your common areas, that's great, but consider using some tape on the floor to mark areas where families can hang out at a distance. For example, you could put X's on the floor where it's good for a family to hang out. And if there's not enough space to keep families social distanced in your common area, then families should hang out in their rooms when they're not eating or using the restroom, etc. Please provide toys in each guest room instead of having a shared toy room, and utilize a sign-up process for the TV area or other evening activities if families can't socially distance while doing those things. In terms of meals, guests should be allowed to eat in their rooms, or meal times should be staggered only if there's not enough room to social distance during meals. If there's enough room to keep everyone spread out and at their own table, great. Please ensure families each sit at their own table and that each table is at least 6 feet apart. Volunteers should not be eating with the families. If volunteers want to sit with families during dinner, the volunteers should keep their masks on and eat dinner at a different time. Families can serve their own food wearing gloves and a mask, but only if it remains covered in between servings. Please do not leave food out, just sitting out, kind of buffet style. If you would prefer to serve the food to the families, please ask each of them what they would like on their plate and how much of each item. And then families should wear gloves and a mask when they're prepping their lunches and breakfasts. Please wipe down high-touch areas twice a day. These include things like light switches, door handles, tables, things like that. We're going to install a plastic divider in the van between the driver and the passengers. No one should sit up front, and masks are required in the van. And what to do if a guest is experiencing symptoms. If a guest is experiencing symptoms, have them quarantine in their room until further notice while you reach out to the on-call staff member. One of us will come to the congregation and help get the family booked into a hotel room and coordinate transportation. The family will remain quarantined off-site until they receive a negative COVID test and their symptoms subside. The staff member who comes to your congregation will also administer tests to the other families present at the congregation to determine if their quarantine is necessary as well. And any volunteers present should follow up-to-date health guidelines regarding testing and quarantining after exposure. And that wraps up our presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We will have our contact information in the description for this video. And thanks so much for watching.